What is going on, guys? So in the last few videos in this modern shed build series, we framed the shed walls, we installed the LP Smart siding, we installed the sheathing, and then in this video, we're going to be installing the trim along the outside corners, around the windows, around the doors rough opening, basically all the trim. So without wasting time, let's get into the video. So as a reminder, I have videos in the description that go over every step that we've completed so far with the modern shed, but this video is all about trim. To start, we're going to install the side trim on the outside corners of the shed. This corner trim is going to cover up the butt edges from our siding installation that we did in a previous video. So I highly recommend that you pre-paint your PVC trim boards. I'll leave a link in the description for the materials I used, but you're going to cut your piece of trim so that it covers the entire butt edge of that outside corner, and then you're going to start by installing it on the less visible side. In our case, this is the side of the shed. As you can see, I'm resting that piece of trim on the bottom ledger board that we installed in a previous video, and you're going to make sure that it's perfectly in line with the front of the shed, as I'm showing right here. Once you have a position where it needs to be, you're going to go ahead and actually fasten that piece of trim to the shed, making sure that it remains flush with the front. I'm using screws here, but I should have used either brad nails or framing nails since the screws were a bit harder to cover up. Now we're going to move on to the front of the shed, and for this piece, what you're going to do is position it so that the second piece overlaps the first piece of trim. So as you can see, I'm showing right now how we get it perfectly flush so that it looks like one continuous piece of trim. Once you have it positioned correctly for the entire length of the shed, go ahead and fasten it with either screws, brad nails, or framing nails. Now I'm moving on to the other side, and as you can see, I did the side piece of trim first and then fastened the front piece of trim just like we did on the other side. After installing the trim boards on the front outside corners, you're going to do the exact same thing on the back outside corners. And again, that's just cutting the piece of trim to length, installing it on the side first, and you may need to cut that piece of trim at a slight angle, in our case 12 degrees, to get it to match the roof pitch. Then I'm taking my other piece of trim and I'm installing it just like we did on the front of the shed, giving us a nice finished trim look. After trimming out the outside corners, we're going to move on and install trim around the door's rough opening. And just like the outside corners, we're using 3.5-inch pieces of trim that we pre-painted. And we're going to install it so that the top of the piece of trim is completely flush with the top of the door's rough opening, as you can see here. After we get that one installed, we're going to go ahead and move over and install the one on the other side the exact same way. After getting both of the vertical pieces installed, we're going to install the horizontal piece of trim, and this is just going to be measured the distance all the way across, make sure it's perfectly flush, make some checks, confirm that it's level, and then attach it with either screws, brad nails, or framing nails. Next up, we're going to install 1.5-inch pieces of trim to bridge the gap between the sheathing and the LP Smart siding below. So to do this, we measured the distance, cut the 1.5-inch piece of trim to size, and then we installed it so that it's centered between the gap. Again, I use screws here, but brad nails or framing nails would have been a bit more appropriate. Use a level as needed to make sure you're level all the way across. After installing the 1.5 piece of trim on one side of the shed, do the exact same thing on the other. That is, making sure it's level and bridging the gap between the sheathing and the LP Smart siding. Here's how we look so far. Next up, we're going to install trim around the front windows. Now, I'm going to have a dedicated video showing how I install these windows, but for now, I'm going to show you how I trim them out. So the idea here is that I'll install trim around the entire window perimeter, but I'll leave a 1/2 inch overlap so that when I go on the inside, I'll be able to push a piece of acrylic panel so that it actually contacts that 1/2 inch overlap. So here I am attaching the 1.5-inch piece of trim around the entire perimeter. So if we take a look from the inside of the model, you can see that we have a 1/2 inch overhang around the entire edge of the window. This 1/2 inch overhang is going to provide a surface that we can push our window panels into and that it can mount against. And here's a look at the window trim installed from the inside. And as a reminder, if you want to learn exactly how to build a 10x10 shed you saw in this video, you can check out my shed building course in the description. So once we had our trim installed so that we have a 1/2 inch overlap around the entire perimeter, I'm going to install some construction adhesive, and then we're going to take our acrylic window panels and we're going to push them into place so that the panels contact the 1/2 inch overlap around the entire perimeter. Again, I'm going to have a dedicated video for this a little bit later, but just wanted to show you how it looked preliminarily. Next up, we're going to install the 1.5-inch side trim along the side of the shed. Now again, this side trim is just to bridge the gap between the LP Smart siding we installed below and the sheathing we installed above. But as you can see, I'm fastening the piece of trim so that it's centered between the two, and I'm confirming level all the way across. There's also a partial piece at the back you'll need to install. Here I am repeating that exact same 1.5 inch PVC trim installation process on the other side of the shed. And after completing the side trim, it's time to install the PVC fascia trim boards. The fascia trim boards are 7¼ inches wide in order to cover up the actual 2x6 lumber that we frame behind it. So as you can see here, we lifted the piece of trim and got it flush with the front of the shed, and then we tacked it in place with framing nails. Now we're going to install the partial piece at the back. As you can see, we're marking the overhang right there and cutting it to size. And the idea is you want that piece of trim to be flush with the back of the shed. I'll show you what I mean in just a second. Here we are showing how it's flush with the front, and here we are marking the back, cutting it flush, and here's a look at how it's flush with the back. Now we're going to move on and install the fascia trim at the front. This is going to be long enough to cover the previous pieces that we installed. So as you can see, we're fastening it to the front with framing nails, and here's a quick zoom in showing that the front piece is perfectly flush with the side fascia boards. And we're going to install the back fascia board the exact same way, tacking it in place and installing the partial and then painting there because I forgot to paint beforehand. Now I'm going to have a dedicated video showing how to install and trim out the windows, but basically you're going to install trim so that it contacts the window flange and install the sides first in my opinion, and then the bottom and at the top. Use framing nails to secure everything. All there's left to do is take care of a few finishing touches. So if you were a bonehead like me and installed the trim with screws instead of brad nails, the first finishing touch is to go back and basically fill in any large voids or screw holes or nails that you drove too deep using some caulk. So as you can see there, I'm putting a little bit on and then I'm wiping it flush with my finger. You're also going to want to apply caulk every place where your trim intersects with the siding, basically everywhere that you installed trim. And the idea here is you want to caulk that seam to prevent any water from infiltrating behind the trim. So definitely do what you can to caulk all the seams and prevent any water from getting behind. When it comes to caulking, basically just think about how water could infiltrate into your shed and cause a problem. So as you can see, I'm installing the caulk around all three sides of the window. I'm not going to caulk at the bottom in the event that any water does get behind the trim, it'll be able to drain out. So make sure you caulk at least all three sides there. And I'm also caulking between the window and the inside of that trim to make sure no water can get underneath. I then repeated this process for the other shed window. Then I went back and I caulked every piece of trim to make sure no water could get behind it. So although I didn't show all the caulking I did, I basically just caulked along every piece of trim on both sides to prevent any water infiltration and also just to clean up any imperfections. Finally, you're going to want to go back and perform any touch-up paint on the trim. This is going to be painting over any of the caulk, painting any trim that you might have scuffed up. But I tried to use a roller wherever I could, and then I went back with a paintbrush to do any of the hard-to-reach places. Then I went to the back where I forgot to pre-paint, and I took care of that as well. Then just go perform any touch-up work as you see necessary. And the final finishing touch for me was to paint over all of the framing nails I used to secure the fascia boards on the sides and front of the shed. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like down below and subscribe if you don't want to miss any more videos in this shed building series. Next week, we're going to install the shed windows, but for now, thanks for watching and I'll catch you on the next one.